And you're rolling.
All right. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Had, and although Janet is present, she's just getting back off the road, so I will be chairing today's meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 1:02 p.m. on the 27th with roll call. Sarah Had present, and I'll pass it to Brooke.
Brooke Dingledine present.
Alex,
Alex Weinhagen present.
Kirsten,
Sultan present.
and Rebecca, if you can. Or sorry, Janet, if you can. Raising your hand is present. Very good. Any agenda updates or modifications? All right. Hearing none. Janet, you still have your hand up. Do you wish to speak, or are you just indicating you're present? Okay, hands down. All right. 105, opportunity for public comments on non-agenda items and receipt of correspondence. We do have one member of the public present at our Montpelier location. So I'd like to, if there's a public comment from there first, please feel free.
This is Thomas Weiss. No comment at this time.
All right, and do we have any other people in person?
No one else in person?
Okay, we do have a hand up from online, Renee. Could you let her turn her mic on?
Okay, your mic is enabled. Renee, you can now unmute yourself. But you'll have to unmute yourself, I think. Yeah, your mic is enabled. You need to unmute yourself, Renee.
Oh, I think the hand's been lowered. Oh, we have a hand back. And I'll note for the record that Janet's having some audio visual difficulty, so she might be calling in, physically calling in. So Renee,
Okay,
can you unmute yourself? And
I
share
think we
with
do
us?
need sorry. I think we do need Janet to call in, or I could try calling her because we, under the open meeting law, she needs to be able to hear and be heard throughout the meeting. So I can.
Yep,
I
and
can
she
try to
just
call
dropped
her in.
out.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Renee, who's on. You are on mute, Renee, while I call in Janet.
We can't hear you.
If you go to the upper right of your screen, there's a microphone that you should be able to click that to unmute.
Click the drop down next to the mic and see which mic is turned on.
All right,
Or if
well,
you don't-
Renee, is there a phone number that she could call in at?
I believe so. On the meeting announcement, I believe there's a phone number.
So maybe if you
Yeah,
wanted to pick up the phone.
Okay, you see the number? Who's doing it? All right.
All right, we'll wait 1 minute to see if we can get her on the phone. Janet's back. So we're waiting a minute to see if Renee Carpenter can call in with her public comment. But to keep the meeting going, maybe we can jump to the next agenda item and come back. But I'll just ask, is there any receipt of correspondence that we have, Pete, to get through?
Sorry, any what correspondence?
It's opportunity for public comment on non-agenda items and receipt of correspondence, if there's any other correspondence that we've received that
Oh,
needs to be
not aware of
shared.
any other correspondence. Thank
Okay.
you.
So while we're waiting for Renee to maybe join us via phone, can we move on to consent agenda, review and approve the March 20th minutes? I would take a motion from someone.
I
move
will
to
make a
approve.
motion to approve. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
so, yep, so I have
okay.
a
So
motion to
I'm
approve from
here.
Alex.
I will
And-
second that motion.
Perfect. Any questions, comments, or corrections?
I've got one little correction on the section on Alex's presentation. Board member Alex Weinhagen, board led. So there's an extra board there after Alex's name. To remove. Okay, I see Brooke, thumbs up.
All right. So any other questions or corrections? All those in
Maybe I
favor?
should just say, Sarah,
Oh,
maybe I
go
should
ahead.
just say that that was Janet Hurley finally signing into the meeting. I don't know what's wrong with my computer, but I had no audio or visual, so.
Okay. So are we good to move on the motion? Okay, seeing head nods, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Hi,
Kirsten,
All right.
Alex.
aye.
I have a unanimous approval of the minutes. We still haven't gotten Renee back, so I think we'll keep on proceeding on. And our next agenda item is discussion of appeals enforcement and attorney-client memorandum. So I believe we need a motion to go into executive session, and do we have a board member that might be willing to make that?
Oh, go ahead, Brooke.
So I will move the board to executive session under 1 VSA 313A 1 E through F to discuss pending appeals, enforcement actions, and other attorney-client privileged matters. The premature disclosure of such would put the board at a disadvantage, and I make a motion for that finding.
Second.
I will second. Oh, Alex got it.
Alex is second. Any questions, comments, concerns? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We're unanimous, and we'll pause this meeting, jump into our next, and be back in a little bit.
Or like, should anyone else be an organizer besides?
Oh, no, there's, the person who makes the meeting is the organizer, right? So the tech will always be the. That also means that you're the organizer, the recording is all the process is one bot. Yeah.
Hi. How's it going?
So waiting.
Oh, you didn't get admitted?
So there was something that popped up and then I walked over here and then it
Maddie,
disappeared.
can you mute your mic, please?
Okay, yeah, they're still waiting. I'm actually gonna take a picture of this so I can show them.
Hey, Maddie, you're on the Teams call. Can you mute your mic, please? We're recording.
Still like.
Did Aaron mean to hang up on me?
We're
Janet,
back.
I'm going to
Karen.
speak so you can hear us. Okay, perfect. Janet, do you want to try unmuting yourself so we can see if we can hear you?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
we can hear
great.
you.
Great.
It looks like we might have to wait for, no, Pete is not coming downstairs. Is it Aaron that's there?
Thomas and I are still here.
Okay, perfect. So I think we're back.
And we
All
have
right, we-
Annette Smith online as well.
All right. So we went into executive session, came out of executive session. We do not have any decision points to make at this time. So with that being said, we'll move on to the discussion of meeting procedure. And I'll continue per Janet, I'll continue chairing the meeting. And I'll just introduce this roughly. I think this was something that we talked about a couple meetings ago about trying to flesh out and have guidelines regarding meeting procedure. And that's something that Janet and I have been working on offline. We have a rough draft that we will share with the board for next week, which is procedures for the meeting. I think one of the unanswered questions that we have within this is we have existing rules of procedure for meetings for public hearings. And that's something that Allison, I don't know if either Jen or I could catch up with one of your group just to offline, while we try and have procedures, make sure that we're dovetailing in with whatever other rules might exist in understanding the proper adoption process and what have you.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so maybe Allison, we could look to set something up offline on that just to make sure, so we can finalize this draft. I think, and I'll just continue on, and Janet, feel free to jump in. I think we had looked at trying to use Robert's rules of order for small assemblies, which is Robert's Rules Light, and distinguish where we might want to differentiate ourselves from that in terms of if you were to use the rules for small assemblies, you don't necessarily have to have a motion made in a second. And I think we would like to continue on with that. Just something that we're mostly all settled into at this point. And also that the chair may vote on all questions before the board. There are different models where the chair does not vote. And a motion will pass only if it receives a majority of votes from the total board. I think we're trying to mimic a little bit of what we've set up as much as possible, but put it into a written procedure so that others might be able to reference and see how we operate. And also that in order to speak, you have to be recognized by the chair. There's no limits on the number of times a member of the board may speak. And you can also motion to close or limit debate. We can request roll calls, procedures to be amended by majority of the board, talking about how we do meetings, how we notice those, and where we usually meet, our times, and procedures for if we need it, like an emergency meeting, and designated time, place, referencing the Vermont open meeting law. Also in state statute, some of the things about draft minutes must be posted within 5 days of the close of the meeting online, referencing the new requirements for also placing meeting recordings online. And also more defining public participation. And just to sort of go over some of the things that we're thinking is, I've seen this put in a variety of different ways, but saying that all meetings of the board are meetings in the public, but not of the public, and members of the public shall be afforded a reasonable opportunity to express opinions about the matters considered by the board, so long as order is maintained according to the rules. I think that's sort of some of the language that we're thinking of. Janet, you have your hand up if you want to dive in.
I'm wondering if our program across the state anywhere in one of our offices has an edition of Robert's Rules so that I can read what the rules for small assemblies are.
So I just found out today in my email from, I think it was HR. I think all of us probably got a wonderful like HR, like spring update, wellness, or what have you. Embedded in that is a link where we are all eligible for State of Vermont library cards, which is pretty awesome, which has in it a whole bunch of different books that the usual library system doesn't have. I don't know if that's something that one of our staff might have kicking around a copy, or if that might be a way for us to get an online version that we could reference. I don't know, Allison or Aaron, if that's something that you might be able to look into. Brooke, you have your hand up?
I just wanted to caution you about, we don't want this to be a document that we have to change every time that we decide to change like the date and time of our regular meeting, so to leave enough flexibility so that, there shall be a regular time and place posted on our website, and, so that those changes are not something we have to then go back and alter the website kind of thing.
I think that's what we're going for. I think by all sorts of requirements that we have to have published a regular meeting time and place unless we change it. But I think this definitely allows for all other types of special meetings and things of that nature too. So, Alex?
One of our first meetings, a document was circulated, which I think was the procedures for the NRB or something to that effect anyways. I'm assuming you are not working from that document in some sort of track change environment, right? You're starting fresh. Is that a correct assumption? Great. I think that's the right way to go. But I can't find that original document that got passed around. So if you have it and could provide it when we talk about this, just for a little bit of compare and contrast, that'd be appreciated. Thanks.
Well, that goes part to that conversation with legal, is to make sure that there's this other document that exists. We want to make sure that we aren't muddying the waters by having this, and to what point do we need to reference the other document, what have you. So we'll work on, and absolutely you will get, as soon as this is ready for prime time, we'll get everything to the board. I think what we are trying to do is now, to your point, Alex, moving forward, recognize all the different patterns that we've created. And I think what we've said too is, although we have this time for public comment on the board, one of the things that we want to sort of embed in this too is at the conclusion of discussion of each agenda item, but before any action is taken by the board at each meeting, there may be 3 minutes afforded for open public comment. By a majority vote, the board may increase that time, but that's something that there are some of these things that public coming in and looking at our agendas will see that public comment section, but don't necessarily recognize that they can talk after. And so I think that we're looking to try and be transparent with that and hopefully make that better well known. And also about how the public may participate, and how we also preserve order and decorum. And just to get through this, and then Kirsten, I'll get back to you, which is, thankfully we've had some great members of the public participating, and we've all been very civil and respectful. But just if we needed to at some point have a way of reestablishing decorum, what that process would look like in terms of maybe a recess, or things of that nature. So I think we're trying to be as thoughtful as we can with this. But at the same time, make sure that we try and put some guardrails up in terms of now that we have procedures where we're going. Kirsten.
I was just going to quickly comment too that to the extent this touches on any record keeping, I would be coordinating with like Rachel, Alex Pastor as our records officer, and Allison in terms of if there's any content. It sounded like there might be some about how the recordings are posted, that kind of thing. No.
It's just saying that here's where you go for minutes or to attend a meeting. It's not the record content. It's really just meant to say, if you're interested in finding out where our minutes are, finding out where our agenda is, here's where it's at, which is very readable. That's information that's readily available to us too. So, but good point. And then we
Thank you.
have.
Yeah, thanks. Look forward to seeing the draft. Thank you for all the work.
Sure. So I think there's just some other like points of procedure in there for procedure for considering open meeting law violations. Some other things that are sort of more recent now, effective January 1st, that we want to make sure that we're inclusive of. So we're going to bring this to you hopefully for next Thursday. We'll get you a draft as much in advance of the meeting as possible for discussion and possible action. Janet, I don't know if there's anything. Nope.
Just, that's our goal is to get it for Thursday, but if what we want to get from our legal team is, you know, not, if it doesn't fit into their existing schedules to get work done, you know, it could be longer. We don't want to throw this at them in the middle of what everything that they've got and you know, dislodge their priority work. So.
Right. I would love to throw at them, Janet. You had in red line a couple of things about hearings. And I think that's particularly those sort of couple issues that I want to make sure before we move forward that they have a chance to weigh in on. So Allison, I'm happy to speak with you or anyone from your team offline and try and find a time, realizing everything that you have on your plate. But just if there's somebody that you'd like maybe me to work with on that, and then Janet or whoever else can jump in as scheduling permits. I can be completely flexible. So.
Okay, great. I think that would be Rebecca on that one.
All right. Anything else on agenda item discussion of meeting procedure? Alex.
Just encouragement to hold off until you're ready. I don't think this is time sensitive, and I think this is a really administrative task. I really appreciate you and Janet doing it. I know it needs to be done, but I don't think this is pressing enough to, you know, push it if you can't get it out to us, say by Monday, right? We had talked about how much ahead of meetings we need material in order to have time to review it. So, you know, if it has to slide to the following week or even the week after, don't worry about it. That's my suggestion.
All right, I'm seeing Rebecca's joining again. Rebecca, you've been indicted as the person for me to catch up on about meeting procedure. When you have a chance offline, we can, if you shoot me an email, we can determine when we can get to this, recognizing all the things the board said in terms of meeting procedures are not top of the list priority, have a lot of other fires burning. But happy to catch up with you whenever. So, all right, if the board doesn't have anything further on meeting procedure, as I just said, it's become our custom in terms of any comments from the public before we move on.
Sarah, I think you do have one more agenda item on tier 1A.
Yes, I was just going to take a break on that before we moved on to tier 1A, but okay. Hearing no other questions or comments, we'll move on to tier 1A. And so I'll preface this by saying this was what I was given in terms of a project to stand up. It's in some ways one of the more straightforward processes because there's not a stakeholder group. You have great guidelines within statutory definitions of what needs to happen and when. But it's a little bit nuanced, and what I wanted to try and do was bring this to the board, introduce this, and also get some buy-in and guidance from the board on some decision points before moving forward with this. I think what I can speak to is we have a great team, great staff. And in terms of moving this forward with process and application and timelines, we have a really good grasp of what all that is. And we've gotten to a point where before I can move the ball forward more with those, I need to find some decision points on some of how we're going to apply Tier 1A. So recognizing that this is on next Thursday for the board to discuss further and possibly have a decision point on. And also, I think I want to be cognizant of what Alex said. We have a lot of things coming at us right now. And in terms of prioritization, this is not of the most immediate. However, looking ahead to the board after we get into May with the stakeholder groups, we are going to be very busy. And so I was hoping that there is a window of opportunity to bring this to the board and get some just rough feedback that I could continue working on this while the priority of the board perhaps takes another turn. So with that being said, I'm just going to run quickly through what Tier 1A is and sort of frame up some of the decision points that I'll be looking for. So once we get through the approval of a regional plan and possibly one of the Tier 1Bs, municipalities will have the capability of coming in and asking for a Tier 1A designation. With that Tier 1A designation, it's a higher level of expectations from that community than a Tier 1B. You'll be looking to exempt an area from Act 250 in essence, but rather also delegating some of that to the community to carry out. The communities that achieve Tier 1A will be responsible for enforcing existing permit conditions for Act 250 and making sure that any decisions that they have moving forward in terms of their impact are done in a way that's reflective of that, reflective of the criteria, and also is communicated back to the LURB. So Tier 1A gives a framework where a community can move forward without the traditional Act 250 process. They will have to look to be inclusive of some of this in their permit procedures locally, and there will be check-in requirements along the way. So with Tier 1B, this is something that people can seek approval for, municipalities can seek approval for with the designation of the regional plan. It's also possible, I think Janet said that after a regional plan is adopted, you can have new Tier 1Bs coming in, which is that 50 units and less. It's that sort of first version of Act 250 exemption. I'm oversimplifying just because I think that a lot of my board members know this, but I just wanted to give this sort of quick refresher. Does everybody feel comfortable with the distinctions between a Tier 1A and B at this point? Okay. So with Tier 1B, there is some consideration that municipalities might be self-certifying some of their requirements in looking for an application. So there's being considered a municipal resolution where in applying for a Tier 1B, legislative body of a community and opting into Tier 1B will say that we have the ability to do this, that we have the correct bylaws. Janet, I see a hand.
So I don't need to interrupt. You can finish your thought.
Okay, all right. Well, feel free to correct me along the way, because we're all getting through this together. So some
Okay,
of,
well, so the issue is that I don't know to what extent self-certification is happening for Tier 1B. There are 6 criteria in the statute that the Land Use Review Board needs to determine affirmatively that the municipality has met. The municipality needs to opt in, and that needs to be by vote of the legislative body of the municipality. And we could ask for self-certification on the criteria, but it's the Land Use Review Board that makes that determination. So I just wanted to clarify that.
yeah, I think, thank you for that clarification. I think we're saying the same thing. I think the idea is that a municipality through that resolution will say to us, and then it's up for us to adjudicate that they've adopted and approved a plan, that they've adopted permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws, they've adopted flood hazard and river corridor bylaws applicable to the entire community, are consistent with or stronger than the standards as set out in state statute, or that they exclude those areas. That they also have water supply, wastewater infrastructure, or soils that can accommodate a community system for compact housing development for Tier 1B, and that they have adequate capacity to support development review and zoning administration for the Tier 1B area. So looking at what Tier 1B is going to have in terms of the requirements and how we might go about receiving and considering those applications, I was looking at Tier 1A and trying to build off of that and not go in a completely different direction, for better or for worse. So moving forward with that, and hopefully, I don't know, Janet, do you have anything else you want to say on Tier 1B, or that these are the types of applications coming in? But yes, Alex.
Only that, as I read the statute, it's actually the obligation of the regional planning commissions to demonstrate that Tier 1B areas meet the requirements, not the municipality. I think that's how it works because they're part of the regional plan and the future land use map. I don't think that matters, but for the purposes of Tier 1A, it's not the regional planning commissions who are making the ask and are demonstrating compliance. It is, in fact, the municipality.
Right, because
And
the Tier 1B applications come through the regional planning commissions.
and what they need to, because regional planning commissions will not be certifying adequate capacity and support for development review and zoning administration. That's up to the municipality. So that's the idea of having a resolution for the legislative body to certify that. So does that? All right, I think yes, Janet.
Sorry, but I think that we might consider guidelines that, they would certify that they're meeting these minimum standards or something.
True. So again, building the plane and flying it. Here we are, and we don't have guidelines yet for Tier 1B, but these are some of the general thought processes that I want to sort of lay out for you in terms of framing Tier 1A. Kirsten.
So Janet, were you referring to Tier 1B guidelines or Tier 1A?
Both, frankly.
Okay, I'm just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah.
Moving back to the Tier 1A guidelines is something expressly that we were tasked with creating, and I've taken that on. So we have this framework for Tier 1B, and that's why I wanted to sort of frame this in for. And there are some different decision points in terms of the criteria for Tier 1A. And to take you through that, and some of these are easier, and some of them are tougher and more involved. And I will say that in looking at the Tier 1A and how it was created, is a lot of it seems to have been pulled from the previous downtown board neighborhoods designation. So if you were to take a look back, a lot of these seem sort of familiar because they exist within that previous designation program. So that's something that just trying to, as we move forward, I want to be cognizant of all the different pieces that are moving in different directions, some of the history, and also how this is different. So I think in looking at the criteria for Tier 1A, some of them are the same as Tier 1B, and there's more to it. So the requirement for a plan, that's the first thing, is you have to have a letter, you have to have a plan that is approved in accordance with 24 VSA. Different technical terms, usually that's a confirmation letter from the RPC. And so that is something that could be a fairly easy checkbox there in terms of, yes, they are a confirmed municipal plan from the RPC. The next criteria is the boundaries are consistent with the downtown or village centers and planned growth areas as defined in 24 VSA and an approved regional future land use map with any minor amendments. And so that's great. Provide us a scaled map with the north arrow showing the proposed bounds of the Tier 1A area overlaid on top of the RPC's future land use map. And so that's another sort of easy checkbox there. Municipality has adopted flood hazard and river corridor bylaws. Again, this is very comparable to what you have in the Tier 1B process. And we haven't created necessarily that process for Tier 1B yet, but I did attend the meeting with A&R, the regular meeting with Alex and some of our other staff today, and gave them a heads up that I think that there's a way to do this which is not going to create more strain on A&R, that they already have somewhere a list of communities that have standards meeting the state's current minimums for floodplains and probably also for river corridors. Again, if you have ever been through the emergency declarations, and I think Kirsten, you were saying, working with your hometown on this, there's something called ERAF, which is Emergency Relief Assistance Fund. I think I got that correct. And so this is something that if you're on that for achieving river corridors and also the state's minimum for floodplain, you get reimbursed at a higher level than if you don't during a declared disaster. Working through the technicalities, not sure that that's the best place because not sure how quickly that gets updated. I think what I did today was I planted the seeds with A&R and said, you tell us best how you want to do this. We'd rather not strain your staff by asking you for a letter of determination every time a community moves forward. If there's a list that you can basically get certification that you're on the list, great. They have with the Act 121 process for floodplains, a whole project to be working on with new minimum standards. So the minimum standards now are not necessarily going to be the minimum standards 2 years from now too. So just working really closely with them. But I think that there's a way to either have communities sort of self-certify that they're on a list and show that they're on a list to us, or have A&R do a quick determination that they're okay. So we'll have to continue working with A&R on that to see how best to go about that. But again, that I think is a fairly easy one to dispense with. The next one is the municipality has adopted permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. Again, they could submit current copies to us of the adopted zoning and subdivision bylaws, and also a letter to that effect, or completely self-certify and say, yep, we have this. Janet.
I think it's important what you have here, that is that they send us a separate letter explaining or referencing any exemptions, because that's part of what we need to establish, is that those permanent bylaws don't include broad exemptions that exclude significant development from requiring the permit. So if they have exemptions, have them outline them and provide reference to those in their application to us.
Right, and some of those exemptions might be the exemptions that are required from state statute, right? State statute says there are definitely things that you need to, that you cannot control. But it would be nice to have a community sort of enumerate it and
Well,
Yes.
I think we're talking about something other than those exemptions here.
correct.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
Brooke, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sounds like the same thing as the 10-acre determination. And I had the opportunity last night to go over the checklist. And I don't see anything wrong with it in terms of any changes to chapter 117 of title 24. And my thought really was on that. When you're creating a zoning ordinance, you could even use it as your guidance document, but it didn't seem like a burden for a town to fill that out because, for us to review it. But if they had a 10-acre designation through that process, wouldn't that be the equivalent of this inquiry?
So Kirsten and I are working on that separately. I can update you with that later, but I don't want to use that process. I think that we have under tier 1A some very specific criteria, and if you read it, it's different than the tier 1B in that, particularly to Janet's point, there can't be broad exemptions. And so that's an area that we need to hone in on and ask specifically and evaluate specifically that existing 1 versus 10 guidelines and checklist won't necessarily cover. Kirsten.
Yeah, so I agree with what Janet said. It's like it would be my interpretation of this statutory obligation that the Land Use Review Board would need to make this affirmative determination. And in order to do that, we would need specific evidence, and we would need to either be provided with an analysis or make the analysis ourselves. And I don't think a simple kind of like self-certification statement as a standalone would, for me, suffice.
All right. I'm going to move on to the next thing just to keep going here very briefly. So the next item on this is a little bit more detailed. And the municipality has permanent land development regulations for the tier 1A area that further the smart growth principles of 24 VSA. I'm going to paraphrase a bit here. Adequately regulate the physical form and scale of development, provide reasonable provision for a portion of the areas with sewer and water to allow for at least 4 stories and conform to the guidelines established by the board. This specifically draws from the criteria for the designated neighborhood development areas. And if you have ever applied for one of these areas, there's a checklist that the state has made available. And you have to get an 8 out of 10 in 2 categories for building and lot pattern guidelines and complete street guidelines. And I can go ahead and share my screen right now, if that's all right, so that you can see everybody can see that. So these are taken right out of the designated neighborhood development areas of how previously within that process, it was evaluated for conformance with that. And again, you had to get an 8 out of 10 in building and lot pattern guidelines and 8 out of 10 in complete street guidelines. So, Janet.
Just having gone through that process with DHCD for a neighborhood development area in Manchester several years ago, the DHCD was pretty rigorous about this. This was no self-certification, and they were pretty strict. And I think, are you imagining the ombudsperson being the helping applicants get through this checklist?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
I think that, so there will be some areas that you can self-certify, but again, it's on us as a board to evaluate whether or not whatever is provided to us meet the criteria. And I think that there needs to be a sort of a grading of applications that come in. Not all are going to pass muster. I think some of the conversations that we're having with staff is how to deal with incomplete applications too, and recognizing that we might have people that go through and fill out NA, and how do we deal with that in the process and turning applications that are clearly not complete or anywhere close back. And so absolutely we need an ombudsperson or somebody like that to be a gatekeeper on this and work with it and clean it up as best as possible before it comes to the board for a determination. But ultimately that is our responsibility to basically determine whether or not they meet the criteria. Alex.
So I think it's important to keep in mind what the statute says, which is, furthering the smart growth principles of 24 VSA Chapter 76A, along with the other items. And there is a section in Chapter 76 that defines smart growth principles, and so there's words in there. I appreciate wanting to have a metric, and I think it'll make it easier. I don't like this neighborhood development area metric. For example, in the complete street guidelines, one of them is to require utilities to be placed underground in new developments. That's not a smart growth principle in my mind. And so I don't know why it's on the complete street guidelines, but it is. And when the municipality I used to work for went for neighborhood development area designation, it wasn't tough to meet these standards because our community had pretty good ones. But at the time, I remember thinking like, wait a minute, what if I score 6 out of 10 instead of 8? Does this community not still embody the smart growth principles in 76A? I think it does. So I would caution using these guidelines, especially with like an 8 of 10 or a 9 of 10 or whatever. I think I would like to do some more work to nail, what metrics or what specific provisions, demonstrate that the smart growth principles are being met.
So I hear you. I think that the words in 24 VSA are hard to have metrics to, and I think wherever possible with standing up these new processes, having clear standards and clear metrics will be very good for us to be transparent in terms of what communities get approved and which communities don't, and having rubrics wherever possible. With this specific criteria, this is one of the harder ones, right? It's harder because you have to there's so much to it, and it's very if you read it again, it says physical form and scale development provide reasonable provision for a portion of the areas with water and sewer to allow at least 4 stories and conform to the guidelines. So this is very broad. We could do something completely different, but again, looking to, before we move from the existing, Let's do so and be deliberate and transparent and provide a reason why. Kirsten,
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that my interpretation of the reference to the guidelines established by the board, that's our guidelines, right?
correct, and that's what we're considering right now, is
Yeah.
what we want
Yeah,
our
I'm
guidelines to be.
just confirming.
So Alex,
Yeah, again, the statutory requirement is that the municipality have development regulations that further the smart growth principles of 24 VSA Chapter 76A and do a bunch of other things, which could include guidelines established by the board. So the guidelines we establish are in addition to all the items that come before that in that sentence, which all need to be addressed. So Sarah, I'm not disagreeing that we shouldn't have, clear metrics to the extent we can. I do. I'm just noting my concern about using the neighborhood development area as the means to do that. And I'm going to put my cards on the table, and maybe this is a bad thing to do, but I do not want this to be a high bar. I do not think the legislature's intent was to have 4 municipalities have tier 1A status in the state and every other municipality say it's too hard. It'll take too many years for us to revise our zoning to comply. I think the intent was to take these areas that are already developed and planned for significant growth and get, that have reasonable regulations at the local level and get development going there. So I want us to do this right, and I want metrics. But in the end, I want many communities to be able to come to us and have some reasonable chance of getting a tier 1A designation, not just those that have, very extensive staff and hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulatory documents.
Kirsten,
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to Alex for kind of explaining that and sharing that, like from your perspective and experience, the NDA criteria go beyond what would be required for complete streets or smart growth principles rather. And if you have time, I'd love to kind of better understand this whole area. Maybe you and I could have a conversation sometime would be great. Or any of our planners, in particular who've worked with the neighborhood development areas. I'd be interested to learn more about this.
and what I'd like to say too, before I take Janet's, is I'm happy to catch up with anyone after this one-on-one and talk about some of the concepts in here, and hear what your thoughts are too. I've tried to be very deliberate about this and bring forward what's out there and existing. And I think this is an excellent conversation, which I very much appreciate and am thankful for, because I think that I want to be deliberate before we move away from some of the things that were envisioned. But what you can see from what I had put up for criteria, it had 3 stories and not 4 stories. So of course there are going to need to be some changes to this. And so I think we can get into the nuts and bolts of that. But I think that this is just very handy so far for me to get direction. Janet.
So just picking up from a comment Alex made, or I think one of the key questions is, does the municipality have the staffing capacity to take on what they're going to have to take on if they become a tier 1A?
We're getting there.
If part of their municipality becomes tier 1A. So
That's a future, I'm getting there. There's a.
No, I know, I
okay.
just want to speak to something Alex said, and so I don't know how many tier 1A designations Alex is expecting there to be, but that I don't want that question to, I think the guidance that we create around that question is going to be key. I think there may be some municipalities who just don't have it, even if they want tier 1A.
Understood. All right. so that was the checklist. Does everybody like the idea of a checklist, but maybe like we need to tweak what the checklist is? I'm getting one head nod.
I like checklists in general. I think remains to be seen what the content of this specific checklist would be.
Okay. Understood. I think that's excellent. I'm gonna shift gears and try and knock another one of these out just because I'm want to give you a flavor of this is where things can get a little bit deeper and with less guidance. So the next one is F, the Tier 1A area is compatible with the character of adjacent National Register historic districts, National or State Register historic sites, and other significant cultural and natural resources identified by a local or state government. So this is very broad. It's the Tier 1A areas shown as directly abutting or including a natural register, historic district, national or state historic site, or significant resources identified by a municipality or state historic preservation office. I propose that there could be some things that a community could do to show compliance. This is one that there's not a whole lot of history or thought process behind. It's very similar to one of the ones from the neighborhood designation process. But again, not a whole lot of great guidance to be working off of. This is also, I want to say that these are my thoughts right now and my thoughts alone that I'll share. But Janet, question?
Did you share your thoughts? You mean are you referring to what's on the paper here?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, okay. So I think that B, C, and D of your list, I don't know if you maybe want to share it on screen.
Sure.
But I think those are really clear because when you go to those statutory references there, they're very clear. And A, I'm not sure I understand what A is, so I want you to explain it to me.
All right. So A is a certified local government community. So that's a community that has done significant planning, gone to the state of Vermont and said, we would like to have this certification. There are some great incentives that come along with that, including some fiscal incentives. But you basically have to have done a lot of B, C, and D. That's sort of the highest level to get to certified local government.
What arm of our government makes that determination?
Division for Historic Preservation and their board.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see. Got it. Yeah, I think I think they're pretty clear, so.
Again, I was trying to go to existing processes that are already in place. To be able to look to determine compliance. So, Alex.
I appreciate trying to go to existing resources. I'm not convinced that those methods speak to the sort of broad, as you said, language of this requirement. They seem to be mostly focused on historic preservation. And I'm not sure that's the only component or even a necessary one with regard to whether the Tier 1 area is compatible with the character of adjacent historic districts and such. I guess what I'm getting at is I think any community that does A, B, C, or D should get a thumbs up from us. So that I don't disagree that those are good checkboxes to be able to pass muster. But I guess what I'm thinking is maybe there should be an E that allows a community to demonstrate this in their own words or in their own fashion with their own evidence. I wouldn't want them to be foreclosed on the ability to say, this is how we accomplish that goal, because it is such a broad goal. And yeah, just because a community hasn't adopted a local historic district or doesn't have a MOU with the Division of Historic Preservation about development applications for historic buildings, I'm not sure that that's a disqualifier. They may be able to make the case otherwise.
So, as I said, this is my own, and this is for conversation, for feedback. I think, Alex, what I tried to do, just to explain before I go to other people, is that design review district is a lot of these tier 1As have cooked into their zoning regulations things that are very much like design review, maybe by a different name, but that could go to like a narrative and like, tell us how you've embraced design review within your zoning. So that was designed to be a little bit more of a catch-all. And then D was really designed to be, let's say you're a smaller community that might not have design review. Maybe you have one historic building that is at the very center of your village that, you know, you don't really necessarily see the need to have A, B, and C for that one historic building. Maybe there's an out just to carve out that. And again, this is something that I would have to flesh out more with the SHPO if we decide to go this route. But again, just wanted to get some thoughts, some initial feedback from you guys before advancing any discussions with them. Kirsten.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this is the area of your memo that I haven't really. I know we're going to have a further opportunity to discuss this, and as you know, and this is not a complaint or anything, but I just got this 2 days ago as we're sorting out our distribution protocols. So a couple quick kind of comments, but I need to sort of ruminate on this more. Is the wording of the statutory language refers to adjacent districts, comma, National or State Register historic sites, and other significant cultural and natural resources identified by local and state. So my interpretation of it, I think, is that it's adjacent districts and then historic sites, cultural and natural resources that would be within the proposed Tier 1A area, I think, if I'm understanding it correctly.
So yes, it could be within the Tier 1 area, or the Tier 1 area could be adjacent to. Yes.
Well, right. In terms of our obligation to verify compatibility, it's compatibility with adjacent districts, national or state historic sites, and other cultural and natural resources areas. And my interpretation would be that the latter of those things, the national historic or state historic sites and the cultural and natural resources areas, those two we would be looking at those elements where located within the proposed Tier 1A area. And I'm not really sure what the best way to do that is. I've thought about, in terms of the adjacent historic districts, conceptually, I wonder if there's some separation threshold, that the SHPO would say, if you're this far away, I guess maybe we would interpret that as sort of immediately adjacent. So, sorry, I'm glad we'll have another opportunity to discuss this further.
And again, this is one of the tougher ones.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I wanted to provide a framework just for immediate response, but Janet, you've had your hand up.
So, I guess I think the statute is worded poorly, for one thing, but the other thing is that your proposed A through D and perhaps an E, as Alex suggested, only addresses historic, and we are also tasked with significant cultural and natural resources identified by local or state government, and none of those address those particularly. So I think, we may need an A through E, and maybe for those something completely different, a list of different other means of
So
identifying and and certifying that they're somehow compatible.
Duly noted, and I was hung up on that for a little bit, but let me tell you what my methodology is. A cultural resource is usually one that is, if it's a significant cultural resource, it usually is something that is possible for state or national register inclusion. That might be something too that could go within the D category. If you had something that was very culturally significant, but perhaps not listed yet, you could have it potentially fall within that MOU territory as well. Natural resources we get into within the next one in G. So I think there's another way to hopefully cover that. And as you said, this wasn't the best writing because it lumped in natural and cultural and historic all into one big lump, which makes it very hard and inefficient to deal with. So once we get through G, I was hoping to use that to frame the natural side. But Alex?
I also wonder if cultural might be a reference to archaeological to some degree too, but or maybe like I said, I don't think this is a very well crafted.
So I think what cultural is meant to get to, honestly, was some of our environmental justice categories of you might have something that is a very significant cultural resource to a community, but just has never gotten the appropriate level of respect and emphasis placed on it, perhaps because it's culturally significant to a minority population or a lesser known religion within that area. So I think the idea was you have some of these things that are haven't gone through the documentation to be state or national register, might actually be eligible for, but just are not known yet. So good point. We can dig into that further. I'm happy to take offline conversations on that. I don't think it was on archaeology. Archaeology usually fits within the state and national register and historic sites. Alex.
So Sarah, I agree with you. Sorry, first, I agree with Janet. This is really poorly worded statute, and I don't think we should tie up either ourselves or the municipalities that will be coming before us based on overly broad and poorly worded statute. I think we should find a way to cut through the knot. With that said, I agree with you, Sarah, that I think significant natural resources is largely covered in the next section, and that's probably the more appropriate place to deal with it. Not that we can ignore it in this standard, but to the extent that we can reference the next one, and I think maybe we should. And from cultural resources, again, it's broad language, so it could mean just about anything. I can give you an example in the community that I just came from of a very non-historic cultural resource that is being developed right now, and so won't be eligible for any historic anything for a long time. And that's a town common, which the town of Heinsberg did not historically have, but is creating right now. And should they come before this board 2 years from now and seek a Tier 1A determination, that town common is likely to be a significant cultural resource, even though it's not a historic area or a historic building. So it's overly broad. It's problematic that way. I would love for us to be able to cut through this and get to get to a reasonable review. And I guess I would also just note, sort of on a soapbox, who better than the community itself to identify what are the significant cultural resources in a particular area of that community. So state and historic registers are great, and we should be looking at those, but at the same time, a little bit of deference to the community itself, I think, is in order for this one.
So before we move on to Janet, I'll just say, usually, and you try and parse out and you try and figure out some of the legislative intent with this. And so you have a paragraph that's chock full of state and national register stuff, which usually you go to like the Secretary of Interior's 106 standards of like looking for like guidance here. And once you get into that, there's a lot about cultural resources. And it necessarily isn't age. There are things that can be more significant that don't have to wait the 50 years to be eligible for National Register. And so I think that there is, when you say cultural within this historic preservation context, some greater specificity than I think the direction that you're going in, Alex. But I think that this is meant to be inclusive too. So it's tough. We can hammer through this more. I think what I'm hearing is we perhaps need an E that's going to be something else. We don't know what that is yet on this list, but Janet.
Just that I think it is worded such that it allows the local municipality to identify a cultural resource. It says other significant, so not necessarily nationally registered historic or even state registered historic, other significant cultural resources identified by local or state government. So I think that goes hand in hand with what Alex just expressed. You know, what better way to identify a cultural resource than to let the local community identify it. And it sort of goes back to what you said about EJ focus communities too. Let that community define something that's important to it. So
Yeah, absolutely. So this was one of the more difficult criteria to try and give specificity to. I'm going to just get through the rest of this rather quickly. And I think with G, which is the natural resources side of things, this was something that when Alex and I met with A&R earlier, I sort of planted the seed with them and said, you know, we have this criteria that a municipality has identified and planned for the maintenance of significant natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species located within the Tier 1A area or excluded those areas of the Tier 1 area. So what I've asked A&R to do is help us weigh in on creating some parameters for this. But in taking a look at that, if you have an area that's inclusive of these significant natural resources, there's already out there a lot of great information about what those areas are and rankings. And so if we chose, I could go into this further, but I want to wait and hear back from A&R. These higher level G1 and 2 rankings, S1 and 2 rankings are conservation ranks in the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory, rare, threatened, endangered species, or significant natural communities, as shown in the Natural Resource Atlas. That was my way of defining what those significant natural areas are, and also what more specifically we're talking about with those communities and RTEs. And then similarly to the historic preservation guidelines, I'm throwing out some possible guidelines for determining compliance. But let me just sort of stop there before I go into the guidelines for determining compliance. Does that seem like a reasonable approach so far? Okay, I'll continue on. I'm getting some head nods, so I'm not getting any questions or hands raised. Yes. All right, so the first one is you could get a determination from Fish and Wildlife that the Vermont Natural Resource Area identified an approximate area that the Tier 1A does not include. So my history of dealing with some of these things in terms of mapping is when these things are mapped on the A&R Atlas, they're very blobbed out because these are protected things that we don't want individuals knowing the exact location of. And so, and they also can move around too. particularly communities and plants. And so you could go to A&R or Fish and Wildlife, and they could say, nope, this area is adjacent to but excludes these resources. Perfect. That's the easy out. And the second one is, you are including these areas, and so we need to delineate those areas and then do something with it, which we could either, the identified significant natural resource is located on a federal or state-owned land or perpetually conserved land. So that's the first thing. So if we are conveying these sort of permit enhancements to different areas, if you have these rare, threatened, endangered species that are on a perpetually conserved land that's not going to be developed, that's sort of an easy one. Is then we don't have to worry about what giving you the tier 1A designation is going to do to develop those areas, because that's just not going to happen. Second one is municipality has adopted regulations providing for the preservation of the identified significant natural resource. You could have within those municipal regulations some very clear standards that are very well thought out that require you to get a wetlands biologist or somebody like that to go out, and that could be all part of the local regulatory process. We would want to see that and be able to evaluate that. So I would envision that if we were to go with number 2, that's something that we'd want to then evaluate and see what they have for local criteria, which we would be getting their regulations as part of one of the previous criteria and could make that read and determination. Third one is that a municipality has actually moved forward with an approved master plan for conservation and alteration of the identified significant natural resource community from the Fish and Wildlife. So you could go in and ask Fish and Wildlife for an approved master plan on a site of maybe areas of exclusion or conservation and areas of development. And Janet, I'll get to you, but the last one that I wanted to go over is the applicant could also execute an MOU with Fish and Wildlife to provide binding recommendations, sort of similar to what I was contemplating with historic preservation for development. So there could be a side MOU with Fish and Wildlife saying that when you get around to developing this area, we get to tell you what to do and not to do. But Janet, go ahead.
Just that for number 2, we could specifically ask that they point to that section of their bylaws and, so that, and ask them to summarize what they think their bylaws are doing in terms of preserving or providing for the preservation of that resource.
Absolutely.
Not that we wouldn't look at it, but, so we don't have to look through 175-page, zoning and subdivision ordinance and find it ourselves.
Part of once we decide directions to go into is then going to be taking all this and translating it into guidance to applicants and also an application, and we can absolutely ask for that. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can see hands better. Alex.
I like where you're going with this one. I had 2 quibbles. One regarding what we were just talking about. I think the language needs to be clear that a municipal regulation has provisions that address these sensitive resources when there's development proposed, but not necessarily the specific identified resources. No community is going to have a specific thing in their regulations for plant species A, B, or C, right? They may have a provision that says if there's a rare, threatened, or endangered species, a delineation needs to be made and accommodations need to be made, that sort of thing. So that's a wordsmithing thing, but the way it's currently worded in 2, it says providing for the preservation of the identified significant natural resource. I think it should be a bit broader than that. That's the way most municipalities' regs are written. And 2, the other quibble was B starts with a qualified professional has delineated the limits of the identified significant natural resource. I think in most cases, nobody has. And so to expect that to have already been done is not reasonable. But if, again, the municipal regulations compel a better understanding of the delineation as a part of the development review process, then I think that's what that does the same thing, but without requiring it that it be delineated ahead of time. Because there could be properties, for example, that have rare, threatened, endangered species locations, and that landowner is not going to come before a board for 20 years or ever. And there doesn't need to be a delineation of that feature up front. But otherwise, I think I kind of like this. I do think that I'd be interested in yours and Janet's opinion on this. I do think this could be a stumbling block for a lot of communities who have not, do not have regulations that specifically address the kinds of significant natural features and critters that we're talking about. But oh well.
Kirsten.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like the last section, I haven't really, got my head around this very far. I'm wondering how you came up with the suggested conservation rank of G1, G2, S1, S2. Maybe we could have a side conversation about that.
Absolutely.
It's all, it's based on the ANR Atlas. And some of this is, I know you're capturing concepts here, but some of where my mind starts to go is maybe a little bit more sort of like wordsmithing. That Fish and Wildlife would say under paragraph A that the atlas identifies an approximate area and that tier 1A does not include the identified significant natural resource. I think you mean like within that approximate area.
Right.
And the option to have a private consultant basically do this, or a qualified professional, I think that should be ideally looked over by Vermont Fish and Wildlife if that option were to be elected. I would want to see some kind of sign off or verification concerning
So this
the
goes to the
particular
conversation to wait and see what we get back from
yeah
ANR, because I think one of the things I've heard from them is Act 250 already burdens them. And if there's an existing process or something that we can use in place, perfect, versus adding something else onto them, and what their level of involvement wants to be. The idea was, I think, to go back to Alex's concern, was first crack of the bat is at going to Fish and Wildlife and saying, does this area include it? And they say, yes, it does. And yeah, you're on their radar. And then hiring somebody like a wetlands biologist to say, all right, they say that we have wetlands within, with some spiny softshell turtles or something like that. Oops, only these 2 parcels look like they have wetlands. And so you get some sort of generalized, like, it's not the whole tier 1 area, it's these specific portions of it. And then you look to deal with those specific portions of the tier 1 area. So yeah, absolutely. And this is one that I look forward to having some more feedback, hopefully in the future, from ANR on to provide some guidance. But Janet, you've had your hand up.
So I think that the statute sort of implicitly maybe suggests that what we are relying on is the A&R Natural Resources Atlas. And that those G1, G2, S1, S2 rankings are the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory Program's rankings of things. So those are existing tools and systems that A&R has in place. And as I recall, I think there was something in Act 181 that mentioned something about how often that information should be updated. Does anyone else recall that? I'll check. You do, Alex? Yeah.
They're compelled to keep it up to date and use scientific methods, and I think Billy Coster at our meeting said there was no funding provided for that, so they don't anticipate doing much in that regards right away.
Right. And so what I was going to say is that there are some issues with the A&R Natural Resources Atlas, particularly regarding some of the rare and threatened or endangered species and communities stuff, because, you know, somebody saw a butterfly in 1989, you know, in this spot, you know, how likely is it that that's still, you know, so there needs to be a way that a municipality can go to the Natural Heritage Division and ask, you know, what's this about and what's the likelihood that this is still the case? And lastly, I think it was fairly routine when for NDA designations, neighborhood development area designations, you had to look at that. You had to look at the Natural Resources Atlas, and if something was mapped, you had to figure out what it was through the Natural Heritage Program, and you had to, if you wanted it included in the NDA, you had to justify that it wasn't relevant to that area. So, like for Manchester, there was a turtle in the Battenkill, and when I talked to the Natural Heritage Program, they said, yeah, but there's no way that turtle is in downtown Manchester. You don't need to worry about it. And so that's the A option that you have listed under here. They, you know, so I got a determination from the Natural Heritage Program that said, yes, we put a buffer on the Battenkill of, you know, 100 feet because of this turtle, but we know that that turtle isn't in downtown Manchester because it doesn't, you don't find it in developed areas at all. So.
Right. And so here's just perspective too, is sort of going along that. I think it's good to get perspective every once in a while. And then Brooke, is the easiest thing for a municipality to do if they're interested in tier 1 is to exclude these areas of significant natural resources or historic resources from the tier 1 areas, because that's like the big easy check. And just on that front, in terms of balance, I think we're better off to provide a way for communities to include it, that the bar is not necessarily so high, because if it's excluded, if it's sitting outside the tier 1A area and it doesn't trigger Act 250, what happens with those resources? You can still demolish a historic structure. Rare, threatened, endangered species, usually it's criminal. Significant communities are a little bit more amorphous. But I think just, I'm trying to take the 10,000 foot approach to this too, but Brooke, please.
I have two general comments. One goes to, on occasion, I hear folks talking, our board talking about legislative intent, and I think the legislative intent was X, Y, or Z. That's a legal analysis. That is, you know, there's a way to determine that. Legislative history is looked at, you know, as well as, you know, court decisions, et cetera, that have looked into and tried to establish what legislative intent was if it was a legal argument being made. So I think we should be cautious about that. And in fact, I think that we should rely on our legal department. If we have a question about what exactly was the legislature intending here, I think we need to ask for that legal analysis so that we're not just independently coming to some conclusion that is helping to direct the bus here. What were they intending when they wrote these words? We need a lawyer to tell us based on a normal legal analysis of that, as opposed to casually suggesting what we think it might be. The other thing is, the atlas, it's a general guide in Act 250 practice for wetlands. You look, the engineer will look at the A&R atlas, get an idea of it, but then the permittee hires the engineer to go and delineate the wetlands for their permit. And so I want to be very cautious about dispensing with that in favor of some easier mechanism, because, here we're talking about jurisdiction and how resources are going to be treated. And if there are resources to be protected, I don't see any reason to deviate from the norm in terms of what scientific analysis we rely on to delineate wetlands, for example. They are general guidelines. I don't think any of them have been set long ago with inadequate evidence. Maybe things have changed over time, but I think we need to be very cautious of this. And when Kirsten talked about Forest Parks Rec being involved, A&R needs to be involved in this, I believe, because they are the scientists that normally handle those further delineations from the general guidelines that we have when we can overlay, a soils layer. If there are Primag soils mapped on the A&R Atlas database, then you have to hire somebody to determine whether or not they are Primag soils, and to further categorize them and classify them as a scientist to say, hey, Act 250, they're not really Primag soils because it's too shallow, blah, 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 whatever it might be.
And so I think that is really what that G is intended to do, is, as you said, when you go forward with an application, there are often times that they'll come to you and say, you need to hire a wetlands person to go out and determine the exact area of that wetland and wetland buffer and bring it back to us. And then we, as Fish and Wildlife or A&R, get to determine if we agree with that. So that's referring back to that process. And as I said, this is a rough shell that A&R, I think I said that, does need to weigh in on this. That's a key component, but I wanted to make sure that we had discussion points as a board, because here's the tough thing with the Tier 1A. You guys get stakeholder groups that you can go to and have a process. There isn't that for the Tier 1A. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of go over and beyond and be very transparent and bring this back to the rest of the board to get board buy-in on this, and be as transparent as possible, as well as stakeholder buy-in from A&R and then hopefully DHP on this, so that we're all feeling very comfortable about where we're moving forward, since this is the first product that we're working on advancing. And I think when I say legislative intent, I can use the terms in more of like, what were they thinking? I realize the legal ramifications behind legislative intent, and it's not my idea to go into that way or unnecessarily. I think we were talking about earlier the burdens of our legal staff, and I don't think we need to go that deep with a lot of the Tier 1A stuff. But there are just some wording things that perhaps we can just nicely say it could have been done a little bit differently or with more structure or better. I think we can all surmise what we need to do from it. But
Be
not to go back.
confidently into the night, right, Allison?
Absolutely. Kirsten.
Thanks. I wanted to continue the dialogue about sort of Brooks' comment about fish and forests and parks. I don't think I said forests and parks. I apologize if I did. I was
No, I'm
reflecting
sorry.
on the
I got
Fish and
mixed up.
Wildlife. So as you point out, it is the larger Agency of Natural Resources. I'm guessing that this was presented as determined by Fish and Wildlife because that is the the part of the Agency of Natural Resources which generally provides determinations around significant natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species, and that it was those specific elements of this statutory language. But I think it could just say more broadly the Agency of Natural Resources. And if we're talking about wetlands, I feel like that's possibly part of this arguably, poorly worded paragraph F that does mention natural resources. So I feel like this is kind of like a threshold decision around what, how is this going to be interpreted, and will be helpful to have guidance. So yeah, it wasn't I didn't envision that forests and parks would be providing these determinations. And again, I look forward to continued discussion of this next week.
Janet?
Remember tier 3. There could be, mapped critical natural resources that end up in some of these areas. And there is something in 181 about how we are to deal with that. Right, Alex?
Yes, but mostly just the fact that we can't delineate so much tier 3 as to make it impossible to have tier 1A or tier 1B in a particular community. Like it can't disproportionately impact municipalities that way. So it doesn't really get after the core question of overlap and, how we deal with that. But we'll figure it out as we go
We
forward.
will eventually, yeah.
All right, so I have 2 more areas to get through, and I'd really like to get through those within the time remaining. And we're gonna have another crack at this next week. These are tough 2 last ones, so I'll try and get through this. And I think that these last 2 will create more questions than they will answers. So I think the more that I can just sort of plant seeds at the board and have your big thinking caps on, the better. So H is public water and wastewater systems or planned improvements have the capacity to support additional development within the tier 1A area. This is section 29 of Act 181 also requires the board to create guidelines for tier 1A specifically for evaluating infrastructure, which says the guidelines shall include how municipalities shall demonstrate that improvements are planned for a public water or wastewater system and at what stage in the process the improvements need to be to provide a reasonable expectation of completion. In the case of tier 1B, and this goes to, if you look at our maps that we have currently online about the interim exemptions, with the interim exemptions, there needs to be an analysis, which is sort of akin to this. And it's anticipated with the tier 1B that an applicant might be able to certify that they have the necessary improvements, because realizing the range that we're talking municipal as well as community systems, on-site systems, there's a whole range of possibilities here. We could use self-certification or request that the applicant demonstrate the capacity by showing available water and wastewater allocations in the tier 1A area, or in the case of decentralized infrastructure, that the tier 1A area has class 1, 2, or 3 on-site disposal ratings per the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service suitability soils groups, which is again using the same maps that we have right now for the interim exemptions. So using that data layer currently to see what areas are capable of supporting infrastructure. While a more detailed feasibility analysis could be required by the board, the interim exemption is a little bit of a precedent, and Tier 1B standards would seem to indicate a straightforward and clear approach might be best. So, thoughts on wastewater and water, Janet?
The VAPTA future land use mapping methodology refers to this very question determination based on soils. And I think there are 5 categorizations. And one of them, number 4, I think the VAPTA methodology, the last time I looked at it, includes, they were trying to be pretty broad in terms of how a municipality might be able to demonstrate that even a soil that is classed as 4 in those data could be suitable. So I think we need to look at that, the FLU methodology, and compare. And if we don't agree with that methodology, maybe we need to have a conversation with VAPTA.
So 4 is basically they don't know if it fits into categories 1, 2, or 3. And so that's just sort of the overflow for that. So I think I was using 1, 2, or 3 because that's the map that's online currently. And we could say and 4, but that just means that we don't know what those soils are. And so they need to be categorized as a 1, 2, or 3, if that makes sense.
Right. So we'd need to have them. So if they want to include something that's not in that VCGI layer, that data layer, then we'd need to have them describe it and explain how it's suitable. So just a nuance to add, I guess.
All right.
Because the FLU methodology will allow that to happen. So,
Alex.
I like what you did with this. My only comment is that the standard is that the statutory language is that the water, wastewater systems or planned improvements have the capacity to support additional development within the Tier 1 area. Have the capacity is what you're getting at with soil types. But planned improvements means you're actually doing something with them, right? So it's not enough in my mind for a community to say, we have no water, we have no sewer, but we've got this great patch of soil over here that we could use one day. They would need to do that and demonstrate that there's a plan to utilize it. So just a little bit, like I want municipalities to have an easy time, but I don't want them to have such an easy time that they could just say, look, good soil over there. We have no capital budget. We've done no feasibility studies. We have no intention of developing it, but look, it's over there. Isn't that enough? That's
right.
all.
Well, the problem then is when you go from that point, and we can define this much better. And let me tell you the problem, and then I'll also tell you the other problem, and then get to Janet. But if you go that route of, okay, it's in the capital plan, but you don't have it funded, what year is it going to be built? It's easy to put something in a plan, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually ever going to happen. And so you go this route of how much detail do you need to have the preliminary engineering? Do you have to have it a bond funded? How far along do you want to go with this? And that is sort of a challenge nailing down, because it's going to look different for different communities depending on if they're using a community system with on-site, if they have a wastewater treatment plant that needs expansion, so many different possibilities. And so once you go down that rabbit hole, it's one of those, what point is the appropriate point to stop and say, yep, that's what we're looking for. So duly
They
noted,
need to do
Alex.
something they need to do something, right? It can't just be that we have soil that has capacity. There has to be some indication that there are planned improvements to utilize that soil. I agree
So
about the rabbit hole, but
this gets harder to plan a metric for, but it might go to that narrative style format where they need to explain to us. And at any rate, that's the first thing. The other thing too is, to Jan's point about including the number 4s and you don't quite know what soil you're dealing with, is, to Alex's point, is if you're planning on improving it, you sort of know what you're working with at that point. So it's a little bit more honed in than the tier 1Bs might be. And here's the good and the bad with this is if we keep this very broad, then you might have some communities that can move forward, and let's say they haven't done the final engineering yet. Let's say they haven't gone to that bond vote. We could give them tier 1A and they could follow this up and find that they aren't able to effectuate the infrastructure that they need for the tier 1A area. So there are different pros and cons with how much do you dial this one in. But part of it is letting that community take the reins and the leadership to, if you want to build out your tier 1 area, you're going to need to also plan for the infrastructure piece. I see our role in facilitating the tier 1B as basically trying to make sure that we don't have a complete mismatch, but there's so many other things that a community is going to need to do to get the infrastructure built to actually support the tier 1A area. Janet, sorry.
No apologies, please. So the capacity issue can also not just be about soils, but the existing infrastructure. There are municipalities that have water and or sewer infrastructure that has little capacity for more. And they might not have capital improvement plans for extensions to areas, but they need a capital improvement plan for their for improvements to their existing systems. Say, a lot of them may have infiltration issues that even though it looks like they have capacity, when it rains, they don't. You know what I mean? So I don't know, just some things that we need to think about pretty carefully. Maybe Kirsten can help us with that with her engineering background, because that's not my wheelhouse. But I know that there are these cases that that municipalities have these systems that have a lot of problems, existing systems. So.
And that goes to the rainbow sherbet of wastewater and water solutions. And so to your point, a community might not have the hydraulic capacity, but they might have the biological capacity, or maybe it's vice versa. And that's going to depend on a system. So I think maybe what I'm hearing also from Alex's point is this needs to be addressed in more of a narrative form too, because there's also the other flavor of they might have the water and wastewater, but maybe they haven't designated it for this specific area. So community-wide, you have the gallonage needed, but they haven't bothered to designate it to this specific area. So happy to hear Kirsten and other people's thoughts too, but recognizing that we're at time and I'd like to get through one more, I'm happy to take some of those thoughts offline and move on to the final one, which Janet had touched on earlier, unless there's anything else burning on this. I'll switch to the last one, which is the municipal staff adequate to support coordinated, comprehensive, and capital planning, development review, and zoning administrator in the tier 1A area. So per the tier 1B process, a community might submit something to us, a resolution from their legislative body saying that, yep, we have the capacity. it's additionally noted that Tier 1A communities notice the blurb and send a copy of an issued permit in the Tier 1A area per state statute and enforce existing Act 250 permits per state statute. So unlike the Tier 1B process, there's other things that their staff are going to have to do perpetually after they get the Tier 1 designation. And it provides for us as a board to have follow-up. We can ask for an annual report from a community. We can do check-ins every 4 years or more frequent, and then they're up for renewal at the 8-year mark. And so I was saying that the board could create a condition of approval to evaluate performance compliance annually and use the requirements of 4460 or when issues with municipal review occur. So I think that that was one that that's going to be so tough in terms of determining, because I think some of the conversations that I've had with folks is they might have the staffing capacity at that point in time, but let's say they lose a key staff person and they have trouble filling it, or filling it with somebody that's of a good professional route versus somebody that's just filling in. And that staffing could change drastically over the life cycle of a Tier 1A. So are we better to let this be sort of akin to the Tier 1B process and build in within our approval some guidelines with reporting and some clawbacks if necessary? Or do we want to spend a lot of time and effort trying to determine what adequate staffing is on this front? So there's a lot of questions around this one, and I'm happy to hear thoughts.
Or somewhere in between, maybe.
Yeah, I think somewhere in between. I think what I'm used to doing, what I was used to doing as a municipality in furtherance of a confirmation from the Regional Planning Commission is to provide them information on both staffing and budget. You know, what does the community contribute towards planning over period of X number of years, and what does the staffing complement look like? Because as part of the confirmation process, there's the Regional Planning Commission is supposed to judge whether there's an adequate commitment to planning or something like that. I forget what the statutory requirement is. I think we could do something very similar. Municipalities would be used to providing that to their Regional Planning Commission anyway. It doesn't need to be the test, but I think getting that level of information with a short narrative explaining their staffing and review process would be enough for us to judge it on a based on what the requirement is.
Kirsten.
Alex, is that report to the RPCs focused just on the planning, the community's resources for planning, or is it also for its own local land use regulation?
It's for planning, and so it depends on how a community bundles that information together. So yeah, this is focused on comprehensive and capital planning, as well as development review and zoning administration. So I think having that information with a narrative that explains, you know, who does what on their staff would be helpful to tease that out.
Yeah, to me, it's reasonable that the board would take a longer view with this criteria and not ding a municipality because they had a vacancy for, you know, some period of months. Conceptually, that makes sense as long as it would encompass the resources dedicated to the development review and administration of zoning in these areas.
And Alex, I seem to recall that's mostly a fiscal analysis that's done as how much money a community is spending. There is a little bit about staffing and some narrative description, but I think what I'm hearing is we perhaps want a little bit of a narrative description on this one too. But I think that in terms of some of the overall concerns, having good approval guidelines on this and annual reporting is perhaps the way to continue to evaluate and make sure over the longer term that it's being supported. Janet?
Just again on staffing, you know, if you have a municipality that has just one staffer that is taking all of this on, then it is a pretty serious thing when you have an extended vacancy. So, you know, so I don't know if an approval should be conditioned on, you know, maintaining that staffing level. You know, just something to think about.
Yeah, I think part of it too is for us to think about what we want our annual reporting requirements to be and how frequently. We could require communication more frequently than a year. But again,
Or
I
if
think
there's
that
a change in status, maybe we should
Hmm.
be made aware or something. I don't know.
yeah, I think that there's I'm just familiar with, for instance, the state of Vermont has a delegation for wastewater and water to communities. One of the communities I worked in was one of the only ones in the state that availed themselves to that. And there are conversations about like what happens if our staff person falls ill or is not available. So I think there has to be some guidelines or references that we can look to in terms of that. And I think that we would want to know that if there was a prolonged vacancy, just because if they are supposed to be enforcing Act 250 standards and feel like they no longer have that capacity or something like that, I think we'd want to know that on the sooner side too. I would agree with that. Alex and then Kirsten.
Just, I hear what you're saying, but I also do not want to be re-reviewing a community's tier 1A status annually. I don't want to do that. So if we want them to check in with us on their staffing levels or whatever, maybe, but like I don't want to do a compliance review every year. I think this is a pretty rigorous process. We're requiring that communities have a lot in place in order to gain this status. Once we give it to them, I think we should let them have it, and then, you know, we look back at a reasonable time frame. But I don't know. Annually to me sounds like overkill.
Kirsten.
Yeah, I don't know what others think would constitute an extended vacancy. I guess with it just can be hard, as has been noted, it can be hard to fill positions and take, you know, a couple months anyway, or longer under normal circumstances for a municipality to get a position filled. So, I think, yeah, I think this is kind of a tricky area. And I don't think we want to sort of micromanage the town this way, but we do need to be made aware if there is a prolonged issue with a particular municipality administering its, you know, its bylaw responsibilities. So, you know, I'm not sure where we draw the line, but I think
Before I
we
get
need to
to
do
Janet,
something.
What I'll talk about is my experience as one of the first growth centers in the state going through the downtown board program, which is some of the early ones had a lot more frequent check-ins, and until everything's just sort of got more settled. And then it was after the renewal of like, all right, we've hit our stride, we're a little bit more familiar with these and have fleshed the program out more. And so I think just let's call it for what it is, which is we're all going to be new at this. We're designing something new. At the beginning of it, we might all want more frequent check-ins between the applicants and ourselves just to make sure that we are successful, and have that ability. Doesn't necessarily mean that we need to avail ourselves of it frequently, but and then as we move forward and hopefully become more confident in our process and more successful, we can look to be a little bit more liberated in some of our decisions possibly. Janet.
Just that, the statute requires at least every 4 years, with renewal at the second 4-year mark. But also that, what was I gonna say? Oh, with regard to vacancies, maybe there just needs to be a plan, if there's a vacancy, we intend to, fill it with an interim person from existing staff or work with our RPC to make sure that, we can respond to applications as, statutory within statutory timeframes, et cetera.
Thank you, guys. This has been a lot today to get through, and I appreciate just having some candid conversations and sort of bringing this all to you, because I think I got to a point where, in order to sort of firm things up a bit, I wanted to educate you as to where I was at in the decision-making process and get you guys on board with this. It's all a little bit challenging, and there's a lot to it. I don't know if by next week we're going to get to a decision-making process, but I think what I'd love to do is to be able to touch base with A&R and DHP and have some other conversations with them, if that's all right with the rest of the board. And if all of you want to check in with me as you have a chance one-on-one, happy to talk about complete streets or other things, or provide other pieces of information, whatever I can do to sort of help with some questions that might come up in the interim, so that hopefully Thursday we could like to advance this a little bit more. Kirsten.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention, if you're talking to A&R, from my perspective, in terms of the municipality identifying and planning for maintenance of significant natural communities, rare, threatened, endangered species, you put on the table an option of having a municipal bylaw that would, or regulations providing for the preservation of the identified resource. I wonder if Fish and Wildlife or someone at A&R has a sample bylaw that would do that very thing, that could be looked at.
I don't
Janet's
think
shaking
they
her-
do. Yeah, I don't think they do, Kirsten. That was a
Mhm.
question. There was something in an earlier version of Act 181 that required particular bylaws on wildlife, I think protecting wildlife corridors or something. And, I think it was removed because nobody has those, municipal level bylaw language for that
Is it-
purpose.
Because if we're going to look at that option, I think it'd be helpful to be able to have some suggested language available through Vermont League of Cities and Towns or A&R or someone, so that each municipality doesn't have to try to reinvent this on its own. That's just a thought.
Right. I think it might look different in different communities depending on what they're dealing with for RTEs or natural communities or what have you too. So there are some communities out there that have at varying levels some of this. I'm not sure that there's a good model out there yet, but well put. So I think I'm going to wrap this, but Janet?
Just that, recall that, as we heard earlier, A&R is maxed out. And I don't think that we can ask A&R to provide that. But I just want to say thank you, Sarah, for putting all this down for us, something for us to respond to, and we're going to come back to it again next week. And if we're done, I just want to say thank you for chairing the meeting today. I was otherwise occupied for the last day and a half, and I just didn't feel like I would be ready to jump into the meeting and chair it today. So thanks so much. Especially then when I did get on, I had tech issues. So thanks.
Thanks, Sarah, for putting this together. This was very meaty, and the fact that Kirsten was saying I need some more time with it shows how meaty it was. So I see the work and I really appreciate it. And I would just say procedurally, I don't think this needs to be on next Thursday. If you need more time to check in with each of us and with A&R, like if it needs to get bumped out a week further, we don't need to have Tier 1A guidelines in place until December 31st, maybe.
Understood. However, I think that one of the things that I'm cognizant of is we have a little bit of a lull in the storm before May, and different timelines and when they converge, and the more work that I can get done now ahead of when, for instance, the appeals and the tier 3 working groups get stood up, hopefully the better. I agree. I'd rather get this right and not rush it. But at the same time, while this is fresh in everybody's heads, I'd rather move forward and get consensus if we can on some aspects and nail things down. So, Brooke.
This is not a lull for me, so I feel that I really cannot focus much time towards Tier 1 at this stage because I am under massive time pressures. It's not May, it's now because I have to get May to happen. So I do feel that I cannot contribute much time at this juncture. I'm just giving you guys a heads up because there's only so many things that one can read in 24 hours at a time.
Understood. I didn't mean to.
I'm feeling a little stressed by getting hit with so many things while, I'm first on the chopping block time-wise.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to minimize any of what you're standing up, which is so critically important. I just meant to say, I think it's going to get worse in terms of everything coming all at once. And I'm really trying to do this in a thoughtful way that involves the whole board, if at all possible, realizing as we move forward with different items, we might not be able to do that with all the things that we have to get through. Janet.
Well, things are going to hit us hard because we're going to start getting regional plan applications, and we're going to get multiple regional plan applications, maybe even before Brooks finished with the report. So we have to do this for the regional plan application process pretty soon too, irregardless of how much else we have going on. So sorry, but it's just the way it is. So yeah.
And let me I just want to follow up by saying, the separation of duties was sort of designed in a sense, and, Sarah's done lovely, amazing work here. I just don't know. I think maybe keeping segmented to some degree might be useful. I don't want to feel like I'm shirking my responsibility for Tier 1, but for me to really give any meaningful input to that, I just not sure at the moment I can balance all of that. And I just didn't want you guys to feel like I was not participating.
I don't think with the workload that you have, Brooke, that I'd ever look at you as not participating. So thank you for taking on what you have with the appeals process, by all means. And I think if I can get whatever bandwidth, and also I think what I'm trying to do too is recognize that we do have to get to the RPC plans and sort of lay out some of this groundwork in terms of where we're going. Some of the work that Rachel and Alex and our staff have been doing and is building out the processes and the applications and the things that need to happen to our systems to be able to take these applications into. It's really mind-blowing